Hello, my name is Katie Groves, and I'm a survivor of long-term U.S. military mind control programming and experimentation. I'm making this video to help educate the public, specifically survivors of mind control and therapists who may be trying to treat them, about a phenomenon called Exponentially Fragmented and Fractalline Dissociative Identity Disorder. It's an extreme experimental application of dissociative identity disorder, the forcible creation of structural dissociation in programmed slaves, that I was forced to endure during my time as a Monarch slave. I was born in 1996 into a sub-project of Monarch known as Project Antelope. I don't know if I was initially drafted into this program or if I was discovered to be a candidate for it in very early childhood, but by the age of 3, I know that I had been dissociatively programmed for exponential fragmentation, and that this was an application of a sub-project of Monarch known as Antelope in the mind control world. This took place in Central Texas, where I was raised, and while I spent time elsewhere, the bulk of my programming was done there. Now, what is exponential fragmentation? Well, in order to explain that, I must first explain a bit about dissociative identity disorder and polyfragmented dissociative identity disorder. And I'm going to link in the description below 3 articles by a blogger named Faith Allen, who is a survivor of mind control and ritual abuse, who has polyfragmented DID, or at least had it. I believe she's considerably integrated now. She's written 3 articles about polyfragmented DID that give an overview of what DID is and talk about what polyfragmentation is and how to heal from it, that I found very helpful, so I will link that below, but I will give a brief overview here myself. So what is dissociative identity disorder? Well, DID occurs in a child, typically at a very early age, when a child is subjected to extreme trauma that is unbearable in the child's mind, body, and spirit. The type of trauma that would render a person permanently insane were they to experience it consciously. In order to shield the self from this unbearable pain, the mind dissociates. The child's consciousness separates from itself. The child may leave their body, go into a fantasy, a dream world, lose conscious awareness of what is happening, and split off from themselves. So while one piece of their consciousness, typically the conscious mind that has the job of writing the story of the child's life, of experiencing linear memory, typically that part of the child's brain will go into a fantasy world or leave the body, but another piece of consciousness, a deeper piece of consciousness, will remain present for the trauma. But this is fragmentary consciousness and does not experience it in full, doesn't have the full range of awarenesses, doesn't have the full range of feelings that the child would if they experienced it in full consciousness. And so it's a way of shielding the self. The child typically won't know that any trauma occurred while this other part of themselves stayed present. And when that other part of themselves develops its own sense of personality, can be very rudimentary, ranging into the complex, then that child may have dissociative identity disorder. And that part of them may go by a different name, or that part of them might not have a name or much of a personality at all, but that part of them is responsible from there on after, typically for coming forward when certain abuse occurs that the child's psyche cannot handle. And a child with DID does not typically experience just 2 states. They may experience many more states, split into many more parts to handle many more types of thoughts and feelings, types of trauma. And what happens in polyfragmentation is the same general principle, but like Faith Allen says in her articles, it's just a matter of degree. So someone with polyfragmentation has the basic mechanics of DID, but their system will split apart into many more parts than the average person with DID. They will have, typically, in order to qualify for the diagnosis, over 100 parts or several dozen parts, many of which are not full-fledged personalities, but fragments, fragmentary pieces of consciousness without identities. And their system is typically layered into multiple systems. So the person's alters have alters. Sometimes the alters have alters, have alters, have alters, and so on and so forth. But no matter how much a person splits, it's important to note that all parts of the person are themselves, that dissociative separation is an illusion. DID is a real diagnosis and a real thing people experience. But the notion that any part of them isn't really them is an illusion. It's a necessary denial for surviving certain types of childhood trauma, and it's incredibly useful at the time, but also devastating on the psyche, and to maintain that denial can be extremely painful and debilitating for a dissociative person. So, if a person realizes this is about themselves, they may then seek to integrate, seek therapy, find whatever modalities they need to piece themselves back together so that they can feel like a whole person again. That was a very basic description of how DID and polyfragmentation work. But I digress. So what is exponential fragmentation? Exponential fragmentation is polyfragmentation that occurs exponentially in the child. And an adult who has been programmed this way may continue to exponentially split into adulthood, but it is not, to my knowledge, something anyone could experience as an adult for the first time. It has to be a well-practiced coping tool developed in early childhood. So when the child splits exponentially, I mean that quite literally. A part splits off and into a certain number of parts. This is called the base. The base number of parts could be 2 to as many number of parts as the person's psyche is capable of fragmenting into, and then fragmenting into exponentially. And this is really dependent on the person's propensity for dissociation and the person's intellect. The more intelligent a person is, and the higher propensity they have for dissociation, the more complex their systems can be. And so this can only be done, to my knowledge, on children with extraordinarily high IQs. So the base number is chosen, and then the exponent is chosen. So if the base number is 10 and the exponent is 10, then the child will split into 10 to the 10th number of dissociative parts. This is an astronomically large number. And if you can imagine that a child is enduring trauma severe enough to induce this, that this could go on somewhat indefinitely, would be correct. I am a survivor of this, like I've said. I had dissociative parts put into what are called splitting factories, in which they were split exponentially for years on end, meaning that my system is virtually impossible to map, and integration is a very long process. I'm coming to the time limit on this video. I can only record 10 minutes at a time, and as I'm not using any kind of editing software, I'm going to have to record the rest of this in a separate video. So if you like, please join me for part 2 about exponentially fragmented and fractalline dissociative identity disorder. And yes, I will get to the Fractalline part soon. Thank you.